Psychologists use attitude in a pretty specific way. So we're going to be going over that and connecting that to some of the theories that we use to talk about how attitudes change our behavior. And we're going to spend probably the majority of our time talking about how people use this information to persuade others to change their behavior. A lot of these examples are of kind of the manipulation we do in advertisements, for example, to persuade someone to change their behaviors toward a certain product. But this can be used on an interpersonal basis from person to person because we're constantly persuading other people to treat us the way we want to be treated. We're persuading others that we want to be friends with you or we don't want to be friends with you. You should treat me nicer. You should treat me with more respect. So think about everything in that context as well. Right. Let's talk about what the term attitude means to psychologists and go over some of the basics of attitude strength, how to strengthen it, how to weaken it. So when we talk about attitudes, we're talking about a positive or negative feeling towards something that persists for a relatively long time. So a positive attitude could be, I like Mexican food. I have a positive attitude toward it. It is a feeling of, positive feeling toward it that persists over lots of situations. I can eat at a Mexican restaurant, have a bad experience, and still like Mexican food. Attitudes can change over time, but are not changing on a whim. Where do attitudes come from? Well, you can probably think in your own life of many examples. Psychologists will break this down into things like attitudes can come from classical conditioning. You go to a local coffee shop and you sit down to work for a few minutes. The music playing is something that you like. You go back again, you don't expect the same music to be playing, but let's say it is. Unconsciously, over time, you can form a conditioned association between that coffee shop and music that you like. Without being consciously aware of it, you've formed a positive attitude towards that location. Operant conditioning works very similar. I'll give an example that some research at the University of Hawaii, the researchers asked students their opinion about a big event on campus. And they divided people into two conditions. In one condition, as participants were giving their feedback about the event, the researchers would give them a lot of positive reinforcement in terms of body language. They were interested in what the student was saying. In another condition, they gave nothing. If a student started saying they liked the event, the researcher just immediately shut down, gave no body language, gave no verbal indication that they approved or didn't approve of the message. And what they found is that the students in the group who got positive reinforcement, body language, and words when they were describing how much they liked the event, reported that they liked the event more than people who didn't get that reinforcement. So what this means, the only difference between the two groups was not the event, but the person interviewing about the event. So that unconscious change to reinforcement or punishment in your environment, operant conditioning, can also over time really change your attitudes about something. If you have a particular special interest and every time that you talk about it with your partner, they show a lot of interest back and give you positive reinforcement, your attitude towards that thing stays very positive. But let's say you go to one of your friends and you're talking about something you're interested in. They give a lot of negative feedback. They don't seem very interested. Well, that might decrease your attitude toward your interest. Another way is through observational learning. Maybe I'm the type of person who doesn't have a strong feeling about what brand of cell phone that I use. But if I see other people with an iPhone and they really enjoy it, I might unconsciously pick up on those cues and my attitude towards iPhones will improve. Now, the breakdown so far shows that attitudes can come from learning processes in our environment. Researchers have also found that Our attitudes are influenced by genes or heredity. There is a gene and environment interaction when it comes to our feeling towards certain events. There is a table in the textbook, for example, that shows that our attitudes toward things is various as roller coaster rides, the death penalty, our feelings of being pro-choice or pro-life, our feelings about education, how much we enjoy reading. There's evidence that your genetic heritage influences your attitude towards all those things and others. Are your attitudes genetically heritable? No, that's an oversimplification. What we think the reality is there's a gene and environment interaction where certain genes might make you more likely to have certain attitudes. So it's not destiny, but you might be more likely to have certain attitudes based on certain genes. Let's look at a more specific study. How do we actually study this? Many researchers use twin designs. So researchers will use monozygotic and dizygotic twins and compare their attitudes on certain issues. And as a further way of doing things, compare monozygotic twins raised in the same environment versus different environments, dizygotic twins raised in the same environment versus different environments. Just as a reminder, in case it's been a while, when I talk about monozygotic twins, we refer to those as identical twins. Their genes extremely similar. Dizygotic twins are sometimes called fraternal twins. Those are twins that are related at about the same level as any other brother and sister. So a researcher can compare how identical and fraternal twins raised in the same environment or different environments vary among their attitudes. Raised in different environments obviously refers to there's all kinds of reasons that one twin might be adopted, both twins might be adopted, the twins might be raised in separate households for all kinds of other circumstances. But this allows scientists they can't go in and assign twins to be raised in different environments, obviously, but researchers can try to identify twins that fit these criteria to do these comparisons. And what we find when we do this is that there is a lot more overlap in attitudes than would be expected due to random chance. So if two twins are raised in different environments, they share a lot of their attitudes, especially if they are more genetically related. Identical twins tend to share more attitudes than fraternal twins. The research cited here is from 2020. It's kind of an update to what's in your textbook. Summarizing the results of their study is kind of difficult because they did find evidence for both genetic contributions and environmental contributions. In other words, it's genes and environment interacting. They found that the best explanation for what someone's added, they were looking at political orientation in this study. Someone's political orientation is not determined by their genes, but it's not fully determined by their environment. Those two things have to interact together to determine political orientation and other attitudes. Are all attitudes created equal? Well, obviously not. You can probably think of some attitudes you have that are pretty strong and some that are pretty weak. I just looked around my office. I have an HP printer. It's pretty reliable. I have a positive attitude toward it, but that is a weak positive attitude. It's not really anything that I'm committed to, and it's not really part of my identity. Attitudes tend to be stronger if they are a part of your self-identity. So I am a cat owner. I have a very strong positive attitude towards cats, my cats in particular, my family's cats. And that attitude is strong in part because that's a part of my self-identity. If I got a new printer, it wouldn't change how I view myself. But if I decided to get rid of my cat, even just saying that out loud makes me feel horrible, right? It's a part of my identity. So if things are a part of your core identity, we might refer to them as more embedded in your social identity. Another thing that helps determine attitude strength is how much of a commitment you've developed toward a certain attitude over time. Part of this is investment, either time or resources. I like to give an example of cell phones here because I've used different cell phones and I know objectively nowadays smartphones are usually pretty similar to each other. The difference between the best smartphone and the worst smartphone is pretty small compared to like flip phones that I grew up with. However, people generally have pretty strong attitudes about what brand of smartphone that they like. And I think psychologists would help explain this by looking at the time commitment people put in and the resource commitment that people put into their cell phone use. I use my cell phone almost every day for work purposes, and I definitely use my cell phone every single day for personal purposes, calling and internet and everything else nowadays. Because I've spent so much resources on it, I bought it with money, I spend a lot of time on it, I make sure it has all the apps that I like. Because I've spent all those resources on it, that interacts with my attitude strength. So I actually have a really strong opinion about what brand of phone that I like, even though I know logically I would probably be okay with a different brand. Another part of attitude strength is whether or not your attitudes, your behavior, and your cognitions all line up with each other. It turns out that if your attitudes, behavior, and cognitions all match with each other somewhat, that your attitudes will be particularly strong. What does it mean for them to match up? Let's say that you're not a smoker. You don't smoke cigarettes, you don't vape or anything like that. Looking at it through the ABCs of social psychology, your affect would be your feelings towards smoking. Behavior would be whether or not you smoke, how often you smoke, and cognition would be the facts that you know about smoking. If they all line up, you don't feel very good about smoking, you never pick up a cigarette, and you know that cigarettes can be bad for your health, those will match with each other. And so your attitude towards cigarettes will be particularly strong because everything's consistent. But let's say that you're a smoker who, I don't know, I'm a psychologist. Let's say I'm a smoker, I'm a psychologist. I know that smoking is bad for my health because I've read a lot about health psychology, and I know that the cigarette companies use these social influence techniques to try to get me more invested in their products. So even if I feel really good about cigarettes, I smoke cigarettes all the time, my cognitions are inconsistent. So that will cause my attitude towards cigarettes to be much weaker than it would be if they were consistent with each other. Something you can do to influence this connection is how much knowledge you have about a specific topic, right? Going with a cigarette example, the more knowledge I have about cigarettes, the more that I can break that link between cognition, affect, and behavior, because I'm leaning more towards what I actually know rather than my feelings. It's also important to recognize that the more personally relevant something is to you, the more likely that is to influence your attitudes. If I am smoking a cigarette and somebody passes me on the street and says something rude to me that I should stop smoking, they're a stranger. That's not very personally relevant to me. It's not going to change my mind. But let's say that I'm smoking in front of my brother or my niece or something. That's somebody that is extremely important to me. So if they tell me that they don't like my behavior, that'll have a bigger impact on my attitude. You can recognize. Uh, Accessibility comes to, there's a word we've used throughout the course, and that is salience. That is how accessible a concept is in your mind. The more cognitively accessible or salient something is, the more likely it is to actually predict your real world behavior. So if something is at the front of your mind, on the tip of your tongue, it's more likely to influence your attitude in a given moment. Let me give a real world example of this. Let's say that you are going to the polls and you're about to vote in an election. Your attitudes towards certain issues in the election might make you more or less likely to vote toward certain candidates, but your attitudes can be manipulated by political billboards. Let's say that you're choosing between two candidates, but you've seen a lot of advertising and you've seen a lot of billboards going into the election about a specific issue that you agree with one of the candidates. Because that information is at the front of your mind when you are choosing who to vote for, that attitude is going to have more influence over your behavior than another attitude if it has been manipulated to be near the front of your conscious awareness. And last, I'm going to introduce us to the theory of planned behavior. The theory of planned behavior is a theory that suggests that your behavioral intentions are important predictions of your actual behavior. Now, on the surface, that makes a lot of sense. That says that what we intend to do influences what we actually do. But psychologists like to break down this process into different parts. Part of what's influencing what you intend to do are the norms that you know about the situation. What is normal to do in this cultural context among my people, whoever you identify as your people, be it your community, groups that you're a part of, family that you're a part of, that can influence your intentions of participating in a certain activity. Next is behavioral control. Behavioral control is the degree to which you believe that you are capable of following through on your actions. The more you believe that you're actually capable of following through with your actions, the more behavioral control you have, and that way you can keep your behaviors consistent with your attitudes. Let me give a real example of this from a pretty recent study. So LaBarbera and colleagues, this is a team across the world, Italy, and an Italian team and American team of researchers coming together. They were looking at theory of planned behavior, and they found that perceived behavioral control can strengthen or weaken the influence of certain things on your intention to perform the behavior. So having more perceived behavioral control strengthens the importance of attitudes toward intention, but having high behavioral control weakens the influence of social norms on your intentions toward behavior. So when you've got a lot of perceived behavioral control, you think you're in control of your own, you can control what you are doing to address a certain situation. Your personal attitudes become more important, but the norms of the culture that you're in become less important. But if you don't feel like you have control, you're more likely to let the group's will take over in place of your own will. We talked about our personal attitudes and planning to engage in behavior that matches with our personal attitudes or not. Let's talk about how we can influence the attitudes of others and therefore influence their behavior. This includes a little bit of discussion about how we can protect ourselves against the influence of others. I want to mention here that there is, so people from different disciplines agree on a dual process model of persuasion. So there are two different ways in which a missive can be persuasive, and I'll give them names in a second, but I just want to mention that different disciplines, I think, are studying the same thing. Even different psychologists are studying the same thing, but they call them by different names. So what am I talking about here? Let's look at this advertisement I'm using as an example to talk about the two different routes of persuasion. Notice that part of what this advertisement does is factual information. So it's giving you information about, peanuts, and that peanuts are a food, they're a source of protein. One way that we can persuade other people is through facts. This is called central route persuasion. But next is we can persuade people toward an attitude with what's called peripheral route persuasion, which is information that is about a product, for example, that is not about facts about it. It is about feelings. So on this example here, we see that peanuts taste good. They go good with everything. There's pictures of happy people eating peanuts. None of that tells me about the nutritional value of peanuts. It's meant to set up positive associations. Doesn't tell me any facts. It is acting on my feelings. So the two routes of persuasion are central route, that's about facts, peripheral route, that's about feelings. You'll see some books and some courses talk about spontaneous message processing versus controlled message processing. And this is a very similar thing that we're all studying. Spontaneous message processing is message processing about the surface features, which most closely matches the emotional content of the message. Whereas controlled processing refers to the facts contained in the advertisement. And I'm realizing now this is not a great example. There's not a lot of facts in this advertisement. So what I want you to kind of do is practice for this topic is the next time you see an ad, right? You see an ad on TV, you hear it on the radio, see it online. I want you to try to pick it apart. Are they giving you fact-based information, cognitions, knowledge, or are they giving you feeling-based information? See if you can recognize that it's doing both and kind of pick it apart. Now, which one of those is better? Well, it usually depends on the audience. One reason advertisements include both is because your need for cognition is partially what's determining which one is more effective. Some people have a high need for cognition. That means that they seek out a lot of factual information. They analyze things a lot more. Other people have a lower need for cognition. They're not actively searching for more social information. They process something and they don't process it very deeply. Which one is better? There's not a correct answer. Both have advantages and disadvantages. When it comes to advertisements, you can try to appeal to both audiences by having an advertisement that works on the emotional level and the cognitive level. So whether you're high or low in that need for cognition, whether you're analyzing it very deeply or not, the ad still works on you. You are trying to convince someone of something, you want to change their attitude. Is it the message or the messenger that matters more? Well, as a social psychologist would analyze it, the message and the messenger are all just more social information that can be more or less influential to changing somebody's mind. So the messenger and how the messenger is perceived, that's part of the message. We find that more effective communication happens if the person giving the message is more confident, if they are perceived as more likable. And another way we can manipulate the message is by giving the messenger the appearance of an authority figure to manipulate how the message is taken. I intentionally changed how I look just a little bit for this slide. What I'm doing is manipulating my appearance of authority. Wearing a suit jacket, things like that, that gives you the trappings of authority. So whether or not you know I've got a doctorate in psychology, if I look more like the stereotypical professor, you're more likely to trust the information I'm giving you. Speaking of social psychology, remember that someone's behavior is always a function of the person variables and environment. You automatically assess that when someone is trying to communicate a message to you. You understand that they're trying to convince you of something. It's got to be something about them, but also the outside pressures on them as well. I'm trying to sell you something, for example. Am I trying to sell you something because internally I have your best interests at heart? Or am I trying to sell you something because there are external pressures on me? Maybe I need to make a bunch of money because I'm in debt, because I'm in a multi-level marketing scheme. If you recognize that someone is being pressured by these external influences, you might be less likely to trust their message. But if you think someone is communicating the message to you because they have your best interest at heart, not their best interest, you're more likely to listen to their message. Now, I could probably put this on every slide in this presentation, but I popped it in here because I really highly recommend the book Influence, Science and Practice by Robert Cialdini. And if you are familiar with that book, you can connect several of his weapons of influence to the content here in these couple slides. We know at this point in class that the brain processes information simultaneously using several different systems. Roughly, you can divide the way your brain processes information into automatic processes and then more controlled processes. So when we are judging some kind of persuasion attempt, remember that we're going to use those same processes, the automatic and the more controlled. You may see textbooks refer to this as spontaneous message processing and thoughtful message processing. Very similar to how other sources will refer to central route persuasion and peripheral route persuasion. In this case, spontaneous message processing is just your automatic feelings upon encountering the persuasion attempt. This is your gut feeling, your emotional response, your prejudices, right? Prejudices in this case, if you see a salesman come up to you and it is a man wearing a suit and tie, maybe you're prejudiced toward that because anybody wearing a suit and tie is more likely to know what they are talking about. Thoughtful message processing, controlled cognition, central central route persuasion. That is all about looking deeper into the message. Depending on who you are, remember if you have a high need for cognition, you might be more likely to be able to cut out the spontaneous message processing and only focus on the thoughtful message processing. For example, salesman comes to your door and is trying to sell you on a product. Maybe the presentation is really flashy, it's really fun, they seem like an authority figure, but you can focus down on the facts of whether logically this is a good option for you or not. I had an experience that was actually the opposite of this. This is basically loosed on a real example of so I didn't have a great idea of what I needed to do for retirement when I had first got my real job out of school, like my first real job. So a friend of mine recommended somebody to me to kind of set up some retirement accounts. I didn't know a lot about it. The person who was telling me about these retirement options was very boring. I didn't really trust him based on kind of what he looked like and how he was presenting the information. It just didn't grab my attention. But then over time, I started to actually look at the numbers he was providing me and think about the information in that controlled way. And I realized my brain is tricking me. Yes, his presentation is boring. These numbers, I don't really like talking about investing for retirement. But if I focus on the actual information he's providing me, I can see that this seems like a good idea, even if it's, not something that's very exciting to think about. So you can both, focus, cut out all those peripheral details and just focus on the message. In another specific example, the researchers Petty, Cacioppo, and Goldman The study is from the 80s, but there are more recent studies that find the same pattern. Anyway, they found that students for whom an argument was not personally relevant based their judgments on more about the expertise of the source. The expertise of the source is something you pick up through spontaneous processing. It's peripheral. So just because somebody's an expert in something doesn't necessarily mean that they're correct about every particular issue. So anyway, if it's not personally relevant, you judge based on the expertise. Whereas students for whom the decision was more personally relevant were more influenced by the actual quality of the message. So if somebody's trying to convince you about something and it is more personally relevant, your brain switches up how it processes that information into more thoughtful processing. I think my example of retirement planning fits perfectly into this. So at first, I didn't really think about how relevant this is going to be for my life, but when my brain switched into that mode, I switched into thoughtful processing. And displayed here, you can see that Petty and colleagues found two interaction effects. The top panel shows students in a high personal relevant condition, and you can see that for those that had high personal relevance for an issue, whether the source they were getting their news from was an expert or not didn't play into their decision. It was the actual message that played into their decision making. However, if they were not personally invested in the issue being discussed, then if it was an expert giving them information, they increased how favorable they viewed it. And if it was not an expert, they decreased how favorable they viewed it. So if something is personally relevant, it shifts you into, I'm going to focus on the actual info. If something's not personally relevant, you're focusing more on who's giving me the message. This was found again by Petty, Cacioppo, and Goldman when they looked at giving the same message to people. Again, they looked at, for some people, it was highly personally relevant. For others, it was not personally relevant. But this time, instead of changing whether the source was an expert or not an expert, they gave strong, logically consistent arguments in favor of a position, or pretty weak, not as logically consistent arguments in favor of a position. For people for whom the issue was highly personally relevant, the strong arguments were really extra convincing, but the weak arguments were not. However, for people who the issue is not personally relevant, strong and weak arguments, they still viewed strong arguments better than weak arguments, but the effect it had on them was much smaller. What does this tell me? Yes, if I have a strong position on an issue, I'm already going to have a bias toward people trying to argue me out of my position. But if I am not invested in the issue very much, I am kind of less resistant to arguments from both sides. And speaking of resisting being persuaded by something, let's talk about a few of the many ways that you can try to resist when somebody's trying to convince you of something. First is psychological reactance. I laugh when I think about psychological reactance because the specific example that comes to mind is when I was a kid. Me and my brother were very picky eaters, and our parents would try to convince us to eat certain healthy foods. I love broccoli now, but I absolutely didn't like it as a kid. And so they would tell us how great broccoli is. It tastes great. It's good for you. It goes really well with the other things you're eating. I experienced psychological reactance, which is when a persuasion attempt fails because someone feels that their freedom or their choice is being taken away. So my parents were trying to convince me so much to eat this new food that I felt I am being pressured. They are not giving me a choice here. I'm going to react negatively. This is why it was easier for them to get me to eat new foods when they didn't try to sell them so hard. They just put it on the plate and everybody was eating it. Inoculation is another way to resist attempts at persuasion, and it's related to, so the word inoculation is related to, like, when you receive a vaccine, this is an inoculation against disease. A vaccine, the biological, the medical sense of the term, is when either a deactivated virus, or maybe a weakened version of the virus can be introduced to the body, so that your body's immune system detects the virus is there, defeats it immediately, but then you resist the actual virus because your immune system has been prepared for the virus, right? This is how the yearly flu vaccines work. You get the flu vaccine, it's too weak to actually give your body flu, but your body's immune system has an immunity to flu now for that particular year. So inoculation in the persuasion sense is when one of your beliefs is challenged by arguments. Psychologically, you build up a resistance to those challenges so that later on, when your belief system is challenged in an even stronger way out in the real world, you resist those persuasion attempts. What does this look like in the real world? Well, I'm thinking about experiences I had as a kid, so another one comes to mind, and that is in school. We would sometimes, I remember having a couple classes that were about interpersonal skills, and the teacher that was guiding the class would say something that we found kind of ridiculous, like, it's actually okay to be mean to other kids. It's okay to disrespect other kids. It's okay to bully other kids on the playground. And introducing those ideas, playing devil's advocate a little bit, we, the students, would automatically come up with reasons why, oh, actually, it's not okay to be mean to other kids. It's not okay to bully people in the classroom or on the playground. We were coming up with defenses against that position, so that hopefully later on, if in the real world someone was inviting us to be mean to other kids on the playground, since we practiced it in the classroom, we would actually be able to resist that persuasion in real life. Now, I want to kind of introduce a situation here where attempts to resist persuasion might not actually be effective. And one example that I'm familiar with is the DARE program. If you went to American schools, you probably were exposed at some point to the Drug Abuse Resistance Education, or DARE program. Now, after I had already graduated high school, I started hearing in a couple of my psychology classes that the DARE program is actually not very effective. Well, it turns out when I looked into this, there are psychologists that are still studying this today. They're studying different programs meant to persuade kids not to use drugs and how effective those programs are over the long term. And the DARE program is one of the least effective programs. How is it that this program, specifically designed to tell kids about how bad drugs are and they shouldn't use drugs, can not really change people's behavior that much? I think if you want to read more about it, I've got the citation on the slide, but one of the reasons is the psychological reactance. When people feel that their behavior is being manipulated and that they don't have a choice of what to believe, it can actually make them resist your persuasion attempts. So if kids are getting very strong messages that drugs are bad under every circumstance, and the messages are so strong that they're viewed to be coercive, that may be one of the reasons that it's not an effective persuasion attempt. Now, this doesn't mean that all programs telling kids that you shouldn't use drugs are ineffective. There are other more effective programs. Maybe some of those programs use the last term on this slide, which is forewarning, which doesn't have a special meaning in psychology. Forewarning is when you warn something that something might happen in the future so that they know to be prepared for it. Like a program aimed at kids might inform them that someone's going to try to convince you to use drugs in the future. Now we forewarned you about it. You can be prepared to resist that persuasion attempt. So that's all forewarning is. It's when you warn someone that a persuasion attempt is coming in the future so that they are more prepared for it. When talking about attitudes, we spent a lot of time talking about how other people might try to change your attitude. For this next section, we're actually going to talk about how you perceive your own attitudes and what might make your own attitudes change towards something, even without pressure from an outside source. So, the cognitive response model of persuasion suggests that we can learn a lot about attitude change and persuasion by studying what individuals say to themselves or think to themselves as a result of receiving a persuasive communication. Even back in the 60s, psychologist Greenwald suggests that this self-talk is a better predictor of attitude change than actually what the message itself is. So what this means is that in order for persuasion to be effective, not only we have to change how someone views themselves and views the message. If you want to persuade someone to change their idea about a controversial issue, you need to make them believe that the new belief is consistent with their personal identity. Give a rather controversial example that's been in the news recently. There's been debate for decades now in the United States between the pro-choice and pro-life sides of the issue of abortion. One way to make persuasive messages on either side is when you're trying to change someone's mind, can you convince them that the new position you're trying to change them to is consistent with how they view themselves? As we can understand pretty quickly, both positions are, in many views for many people, they are contradictory toward each other. So it's not just about changing someone's mind about particular facts about each side. Oftentimes people will agree on the facts from one side to the other, but they don't want to view themselves as someone who supports the opposite side, regardless of what that side is. So we want to learn about our attitudes. We have to realize how we convince ourselves constantly of our own attitudes. The next point I want to talk about is positive self-talk. So when I'm talking about how we convince ourselves of our own attitudes, we try to contain opinions about things that are consistent with a view of ourselves that lets us view ourselves favorably. So if your position on an issue causes you stress, you're more likely to change your position on that issue. When we think about some of those ways we've already talked about protecting yourself against attitude change, we can think of it in terms of protecting our own ego, not just our position on random issues. For our last topic here, I want to present you with a scenario real quick. This is based on a real study that was done by psychologists. So the psychologists recruited two groups of people. They divided them into group A and group B randomly. They had both groups of people come into a lab and do some basic psychology tasks, so, a survey and some other really boring things. They actually designed it intentionally to be very boring. At the end of the very boring set of tasks, both Group A and Group B were paid for being in the psychology study, and then they were kind of sent away from the boring task, but they did receive some follow-up questions about how fun, how interesting, how exciting were the tasks that they completed for their psychology study. Now, I told you it was designed to be very boring. So you would imagine that both group A and group B reported it was boring. All right, so what was the difference? Why were there two groups, group A and group B? Group A was paid $20 for their time. Group B was paid $1 for their time. Otherwise, everything in the experiment was the exact same. Now, people in the condition that got paid $20 at the end of the study reported that the task was indeed boring. It was designed to be boring. So, of course, they reported that it was very boring. What's interesting is that participants in the $1 condition reported that the task was much more fun, exciting, and interesting than people in the other condition. How could that simple change, going down from $20 to $1, make people find the task much more exciting and interesting? What cognitive psychologists think is happening here is what's known as cognitive dissonance. Specifically, I'm going to connect to effort justification. So cognitive dissonance occurs when you have two incompatible thoughts in your head at the same time. Now, in this study, in group A, the people who did something boring and got paid $20 for it, they didn't have any incompatible thoughts in their head. They spent time, they got paid for it. Their brain is not stressed out at all. But for participants in the condition where they did a very boring task and only got paid $1, there was some tension there because they spent quite a bit of time and they didn't really get paid very well considering the time that they spent. That tension could be solved by the brain if their brains could convince them that the task they did was actually, it was fairly interesting. It was okay fun. It was kind of exciting. That reduces the tension. They no longer believe that they did something incompatible with their own interests, because who would sit around, doing something extremely boring for somebody else just to get paid $1? How does this apply to real world situations? Well, cognitive dissonance occurs anytime that two of your attitudes are inconsistent with each other, or if your behavior is inconsistent with one of your attitudes. The unpleasant feeling you have of inconsistency between those things is known as cognitive dissonance. Let's say, for example, that I believe that pollution is bad, but I also threw some trash out of the side of my car after I went through a drive-through restaurant. Because my behavior and my attitudes don't match up, I'm going to feel cognitive dissonance. Now, my brain can solve that cognitive dissonance one of several ways. One is that it could say, my behavior, not so bad after all. Yeah, I threw some trash out of the side of my car, but it's not that big of a deal. It's okay. Pollution is still bad. Another way that my brain can solve the cognitive dissonance is by changing my attitude towards pollution. Yeah, I threw some trash out of the side of my car. Pollution is really not that big of a deal, so it's okay. I could also have adjusted my behavior. If pollution really is that big of a deal to me, then when I threw trash out of my car and it ended up on the ground, I could feel bad about it, get out of my car, pick it back up. Okay. Any of those solutions will reduce the amount of tension that I feel that I have two beliefs that contradict each other. Let's say that another example of two attitudes. Let's say that I have a favorite candy bar. I really love this candy bar, and I also believe that businesses should treat their employees fairly. Those two attitudes are not inconsistent whatsoever. But let's say that I find out that the company that makes my favorite candy bar actually don't treat their employees very well at all. So now I have cognitive dissonance, and my brain can solve it one of several different ways. One is my brain could automatically adjust how much I like the candy bar so that I like it less. Another way to solve the cognitive dissonance would be for my brain to adjust how I feel about fair labor practices. I care less about fair labor practices. Either way, that would solve the tension that I now feel between two of these different attitudes that I feel. What's the correct way to solve cognitive dissonance when you believe two things and they're not compatible with each other? As a psychologist, I gotta say, your brain isn't giving you the correct solution. It's giving you the easiest solution. So do I think it's just as likely that my brain is going to make me like the candy bar less, or it's going to make me care less about fair labor practices? I don't trust my brain. It might make me feel like businesses treating their employees unfairly is okay. That would be a way for my brain to solve cognitive dissonance. Even if I logically don't like that, my brain might do that. So cognitive dissonance occurs anytime that you have, these two incompatible things happening at the same time. And your brain is going to try to solve that cognitive dissonance. If it doesn't, you're just going to still experience that unpleasant feeling when two of your um, attitudes don't match up with each other. Another way that your brain can try to reduce your feeling of cognitive dissonance, this is where motivated reasoning comes in. Motivated reasoning is a term for the finding that your brain often comes up with explanations for your behavior and your attitudes after you've already engaged in a behavior. So we are going to split reality in two for just a second. Let's say that you um, go to the gas station and you walk in, you need something to drink, and the universe splits and you've got two different choices. You can buy from company A or company B. You get a Coke at the gas station. Motivated reasoning is going to tell you you like Coke better. That's why you bought it. But in the other universe where you made the decision to buy Pepsi instead, motivated reasoning is going to tell you Pepsi's better. That's why you bought it. This is happening constantly. My cat's food alarm goes off in the middle of lecture. Motivated reasoning happens automatically where I'm telling myself that having outside noises happen during the lecture is not really that big of a deal. My cat is really important to me and it doesn't matter. My brain is constantly going to be coming up with reasons to explain my behavior that keep me feeling like a good person and a consistent person. So motivated reasoning is referred to in a recent book as your inner lawyer. Your inner lawyer is there to come up with reasons to explain your behavior, even after you perform the behavior. You may think that your feelings about an issue determine how you act, and that's true to an extent, but it can also go the other way around. Your actions could determine how you feel about certain things because your brain is explaining your actions after the fact.